Look, obviously, we were on the road a little bit last week. We had a lot of good time with with a number of the prospects that we saw, throughout the country over the last 5 or 6 days. Without necessarily going into specifics for each visit, like all of them, and this is not just cliche, all of them were really positive visits. And you use the visits for maybe different purposes depending on who the prospect is. Obviously, with quarterbacks, you want to spend as much time as possible. Some of that might be to get to know their support system. Some of that might be to get a better sense of like where they are from a baseline standpoint with their football knowledge coming into the league. And some of it may be physical. You may want to see them make a number of different throws that maybe they didn't do as much on tape. So it really just depends on the prospect. But a big part of it is just getting to spend time with the individuals, and that was certainly fruitful over the last couple of days.
Why the private workouts? What do you get out of those that maybe you don't at a regular program?
Yeah, so it's two things. Sometimes, honestly, it's just like logistics. It's just because, with the pro day schedules in the screen, we actually try to be like pretty cognizant of the fact that usually guys, when they're particularly quarterbacks, if they're preparing for a script at the pro day, like as a courtesy, you try not to necessarily overburden them beforehand. And so part of it is maybe a little bit like just logistics as you're trying to fit in, a number of different workouts. But then the other part of it is you have maybe a little bit more control over how the day goes, because there may be some throws that go into like a script that, maybe aren't necessarily a part of your offense, or like you've seen them make 1,000 times, and you can be a little bit more targeted with it, right?
It's two questions about the skin of the workouts. The time we reached the Las Vegas girl, and number two, why is it important to have the owner?
Yeah, so those are honestly really great questions. I don't really feel comfortable going into like the details in terms of how we construct our privates in terms of the travel party and why. I guess probably what I'll say more generally, you always have like your offensive coordinator, your position coach involved in like the QB process, and that would probably be the case for really any position. And then, like, in terms of quarterbacks, I'd say more generally, in terms of players that you're considered really high in the draft, those are players, a la Myles, who you hope are going to be with the organization from the day they're drafted till, the day they really hang it up. They really become, players that are players who can be part of like the identity of the organization. And so I've always felt like, those are the type of players that end up having a relationship with the Browns or ownership well past their playing career. And I think it's just important for ownership in those situations to get a feel for the person, get a feel for the sport network.
So the first, the recent Musgraves,
I'm sorry?
what recent Musgraves?
So I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. I was saying what are the words involved in the process, absolutely. Yeah.
Affirmation over here.
Sure.
Andrew, what would you attribute to, at this point, the offseason only adding one quarterback in Kenny Pickett? And do you think that free agent quarterbacks were maybe concerned about the prospects of you picking quarterback at 2 and maybe weren't getting usurped there?
Yeah, it's a good question, Daniel. I think that number one, we're March 30th. We don't play games till September. We'll continue to build out the quarterback room, no different than the other positional rooms. So, I'm not really necessarily too worried about that part of it. In terms of veteran quarterbacks and us maybe still worried, the concern of us having the number 2 overall pick. I think each case is different, and I think probably if like you're a veteran quarterback on the market, and even if you're us, and as we think about how we want to transition different parts of the roster, every fit's not necessarily going to be perfect. So like, yeah, I'm sure there absolutely are some veterans that would be apprehensive about going to any team that has a high pick in the draft, with the concerns like, hey, am I essentially going to be a placeholder for a highly drafted quarterback? I think that concern is very real for some veteran quarterbacks on the marketplace. That all being said, I wouldn't say that was necessarily a driver for some of our decisions so far. But yeah, I think that dynamic definitely exists in the marketplace.
Seemingly poised to take him overall. Of course, we don't know that for sure yet. But they also mentioned that they are kind of open to trading what are the chances that you were trying to trade out?
Yeah. So I guess I'd say like at this point in the process, anything is possible. Candidly, I wouldn't necessarily see that as likely. There are a number of players that that we like, in this draft, relatively high. But, I think as we come to really the end of March, first week of April, like we're coming down the home stretch, so to speak, about probably the player assessment phase of the draft process, and then as we really get into the month of April, that's when we really dive into strategy.
Would you find it to be somewhat unlikely because you don't think that they're actually going to pick, or because you have enough things that you like at number 2 that you probably not going to?
Yeah, I'd say maybe it's like either or both, so to speak. Like I don't know that I would pin it down to a specific reason. I think, like, even if you look at historically, I don't know that there's ever really been a trade from 2 to 1. I think like it's pretty rare for the number 1 overall pick to get traded, and I think some of that may be in part of like who's sitting at the top of the draft, and the other part of it might just be the cost of like, okay, the cost of going 2 to 1 is a lot different than the cost of going from 76 to 75, for instance, and you have to weigh all of that in terms of how it fits in your overall offseason plan and what else you can do in the draft. So I think that's probably why it occurs pretty infrequently.
Similarly, have you taken calls on the number 2 pick, and are you open to potentially moving back?
I'd say like anything, like I wouldn't maybe out of respect to other teams talk about those type of discussions, but like I'd say, Daniel, that we're pretty open to anything that we think can be advantageous to us.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case, Tony. I think that we're probably just a bit more narrow in our focus in terms of the type of veteran that we think would fit where we are from a roster perspective, where we want that quarterback room to be. I think something could happen before the draft. I think, look, I wouldn't rule it out that it could happen after the draft. I think that's fair as well, but I wouldn't necessarily pin it down to any one time frame.
Ideally, you want 2 veterans and 1 young, not 1 vet, 2 young.
It probably depends more on the player than the actual like age. I'd say this, like, we'll probably skew young, just to be quite frank. I think that's probably more appropriate relative to our our longer term goals.
Do you feel like you've met, it seems like, personally, with these prospects, the top prospects, multiple times already? Do you feel comfortable going into next month that you're kind of all you can gain from these meetings? Do you feel comfortable with all of these individuals?
That's definitely the goal, Chris. To know as much about these guys as you possibly can, and I would say that's not even just for players that you consider with your top pick, but players that you would consider up and down the draft. Obviously, you're able to and lean towards spending more of your time and more of your resources on the guys at the top, just because they can have such an outsized impact and outsized like tenure with your organization. But we feel confident that we'll feel pretty good about knowing the ins and outs of these guys by the time we get to April 24th.
Regardless who you take, how much time will you have spent with them when you get there?
Without giving a lot, would be like it's a good question. I never really thought about it in terms of hours, Jason. But you'll have multiple touch points in season, whether it's personally or with your scouting staff, during the All-Star season, during the Combine, bringing them to Cleveland, going out to their campuses, Zoom, so a lot of different touch points throughout the process. That's honestly, it's maybe that's something I'll figure out before. That's all right. That's a fine, Tony. There is something I'll figure out before our pre-draft pressure and have a snap for you.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
So you go here, I'm in Colorado. Like, does the decision get made as soon as you get back? What is left after?
No, it's a good question. I'd say the answer is no, or at least not necessarily. Do believe in using the shot clock and like using the time that's available to you. I think by that time we'll have a pretty good sense in terms of how we view the individuals as both players and people. But I wouldn't maybe undersell the amount of time that we start thinking through, draft strategy, because you can walk a number of different paths with that pick. Whether you pick quarterback, a non-quarterback, trade up, trade down, like looking at all those different scenarios and then seeing how the draft could possibly sequence from there, and then ultimately like how good you feel about those outcomes, both in the short term and how it sets the franchise up in the longer term.
From your perspective,
I gotta ask this. 25 years of this expansion team. Nobody's had more fun than the 4 weeks prior. What is the hangout? Available? He's a 10th. He's affordable. What's the club's hangout for bringing Flacco back?
Yeah, Tony, I wouldn't go into any, like I said, any specific free agent player in terms of like, maybe our thinking in regards to like the relative strengths or weaknesses, whether that's on-field, off-field costs, things like that. We do have a pretty specific focus with our quarterback room, both in the short term and long term. And we'll fill it with players that we feel that ain't important. I'm sorry that may sound a little bit vague, but I really wouldn't go into the details necessarily with any specific player.
From your perspective, how did the Kenny Pickett trade come together? Because he told us that on his exit meetings, like he must be like we might look to trade you. So was that like, did you kind of seek that out, or was more them reaching out? Anthony, you kind of looked into it.
No, it was something that we sought out, Daniel. Kenny was actually someone that even when Philly traded for him, I guess that was last year. It was someone that we were interested in at the right cost. Now, the realism of that trade happening between us and Pittsburgh, we realized was pretty remote. So with Kenny, a young player, we spent a good amount of time with him during the pre-draft process when he came out. Feel like he's a good decision maker. He does a really good job of protecting the ball. He's very mobile. And we think that like his relative strengths are something that fit well with the offense that we're putting into place for this upcoming year. We do think that there's a pretty credible path for him to continue to improve and take a step forward. And I think you've seen that with players that they get into maybe new or sometimes maybe better environments for their particular path in their career. It's a little bit like when we signed Jacoby in 2022. It was really a little bit more of an afterthought transaction, but we felt like Jacoby was a good decision maker who took care of the ball and probably could make a few more plays than he was given credit for when he was in a really challenging situation his last year in Miami. Kenny has, I'm not saying Kenny is Jacoby, but he has a similar profile, but with probably a little bit more physical talent. So we're excited to work with him. He'll have a chance to compete for the job. Nothing's given in that regard, and we will continue to add competition to the room, but we are looking forward to working with him.
Whether you're down to 2 rookie quarterbacks or 6, do you envision when that guy will play, or does that just totally depend on who it is in the situation?
I am a believer that it totally depends on the player in the situation. I think that every rookie, they kind of acclimate differently, and I wish there was a formula or an easy solution for like, okay, hey, these are the type of guys they hit the ground running. These are the guys that stub their toe and then they figure it out year 2. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Like, look, I love for a rookie quarterback to come in and make a seamless transition, but we also have to make sure that the room is situated where that if that individual doesn't, they're not necessarily forced into action before they're ready.
No, you're a better.
I wasn't there, but I got a few texts, Tony. I guess the was it Chipotle in Westlake? Is that it? I guess the Chipotle in Westlake, they must have some pretty good burritos. So that's all I really have to say. Yeah, it had nothing to do with the Browns. Yeah.
As relates to the number 2 overall pick, to me at least, it seems like you guys need a quarterback, you have number 2 pick, probably take a quarterback. But why is that maybe not an accurate statement? And where do you stand on that?
I'd just say we're still working through it. there are a bunch of players that we like at the top of the draft, and we'll continue to do our work on them. And I'd say including quarterbacks. And so that's part of what next week and the next couple weeks are about. Figuring all that out. The good thing is we still have time. We have a month. It's a big decision, so there's no sense in rushing it. And we're gonna use all the time that we have to make the best decision for the organization.
After the Cardinals canceled 3 opportunities to work out for team. Pro days, and then you tried it last week. Is there a concern there?
No, there isn't, Tony. I mean, I think the big thing is, he still is recovering from, active injury. And that's something that you understand. Like, there are a number of prospects that go through that during the pre-draft process. Obviously, he had the shoulder coming out of a very late, college football playoff push that kind of knocked him out of the combine, and then pulled his hamstring actually training, probably overtraining, that knocked him out of the pro day. And so, like, look, there are a number of guys that have done enough on film, and not for every player, the most important part isn't necessarily the measurables or the on-field part. Like, he certainly answered, that part, but there's really no question in terms of how physically gifted he is. So some of the other parts of the process are a little bit more important in that regard. Yeah, so that's something that obviously, I'd say for us, like, we feel like is not going to be prohibitive of him having a long and successful career. Obviously he'll be in the medical recheck in Indy in the next couple weeks, and we'll get an update there, but that's not something that's a significant concern for us at the moment.
Andrew, the last time we talked to you, there was kind of a cold war between you and you guys and Myles, and everyone was sort of dug into their positions, it seemed like. What led to kind of the thawing out, and how did that kind of come about from your guys' perspective in terms of getting to the point where you guys were equal?
Yeah, Chris, honestly, I wouldn't describe it as a cold war. Like, I know that's fun in terms of how it's like portrayed publicly and everything like that, but we didn't really have any animosity towards Myles or his kid. I'm like, look, I've known Myles since he was 21 years, and that relationship will span beyond his football career. With the Browns. There are just sometimes situations that you get through in professional sports where you have to work for them, day by day and week by week. But we're really happy to have him, for the long term. And he's a big part of our organization, a big part of what we're going to do next year, and a big part of what we're going to do in the future.
Andrew, one of the more interesting signings his guys made was bringing in Tevin Jenkins. I think a lot of people thought that he was going to get a bigger contract and maybe go to
So do we.
maybe go to a situation where he maybe had a clear path to start. I was just curious what happened there. Was he brought into a depth? Was he brought into the tackle? And especially with the line, where does he start?
Yeah, it's a great question, Daniel. It's not a market that we were planning on being in, but I always talk about being opportunistic when you can. We felt like this was a 27-year-old, very talented player. Obviously has played a number of quality snaps at guard, has played tackle before. We always believe in investing in the line of scrimmage. We always believe in being deep in the O-line. And it was just as simple as like, hey, this is too good of a player and too good a value to pass up. Let's add him to our roster, and then we'll figure it out.
Do you expect Wyatt to be on the roster in 2025?
Yeah, I do.
You're the only person who's come up with state to see Travis Hunter as a wide receiver. You see him also contributing on defense?
Yeah, I'd say this, Tony. I think, maybe respectfully, part of what I said regarding Travis got, maybe perhaps a little overlooked. Because the first part of that question, it was like, okay, hey, like, can he play both ways? And I think the answer is yes. Like, he can play either position. I think he'll play both sides of the ball, in the NFL. I truly do. How that balance looks, I think, depends on the relative schemes on each side of the ball, and then how much he can handle, probably more physically than mentally. He's brilliant. Like, he's brilliant for the football standpoint, has rare intelligence. So I don't think that there's necessarily a limit in terms of how you can use him. I think he'll be good at either spot. That's right. I'd say this, like, that's the type of individual, both in terms of his makeup and his physical skill set, that I wouldn't put limits on before he touches the grass. I mean, it's funny. I was actually, I was talking to, some of this. I was actually talking to Kevin about this earlier in the week. That I think one of the more misguided comparisons is when people talk about Travis relative to, and this is with all due respect because these guys are Hall of Famers, to Charles Woodson and Champ Bailey, right? They say like, hey, Charles Woodson, first predominant defensive player to win the Heisman, but he was really a two-way player. Champ was a two-way player. And I think what people don't realize is, so Charles Woodson in his college career, I realize it was a different era, but he had almost as many college receptions in his 3-year career as he did interceptions. He had 21 catches in college, and 16 passes. Champ Bailey had 59 catches in his 3-year career and under 1,000 yards, and I think 8 picks. Travis in the past 2 years, so Travis, 5th in the nation in receiving, led the Big 12 with 96 catches, 15 touchdowns, 7 career picks, like truly was a full-time player on both sides of the ball. And that's where he's like, I think there's maybe a little bit lost historically in terms of like how rare of what he accomplished at Colorado. Yeah, it's like he didn't moonlight on the offensive side of the ball. In fact, like if you think about it, this year alone, he had more, I want to say he had more catches, yards, and touchdowns than both Charles and Champ did combined in their 3 years. And so I think that maybe paints like how incredible of a season, and really 2 seasons that Travis has had. And that's why I see it a little bit differently than those guys.
That's why we required him, man. Like, we like Mason Rudolph.
Look, I think the most straightforward path to contention is, you get your version of Jaden Daniels in the draft, and you're off and running. That's 2 fines. You're fine, Tony. It's just, that's right. We'll just add it to the fine pot. But I think that's a little bit more the exception rather than the rule, and that's I can't remember if Jason or Zach asked the question about rookie quarterbacks transitioning. You just never know how that's going to happen. But I think maybe the broader point is, there's more than one avenue to, I guess, building a contending team or walking that path, and that's why I don't undersell the amount of time that we think through, okay, how could a variety of possible paths look? Look, we could just sit and pick it too. Like, I'm not saying that that's not necessarily going to happen on the 24th, but as we sit here on March 30th, I think there's plenty of work to do.
Is the doors still open for Nick to return, or would you say you're kind of looking elsewhere by the time still?
No, I'd say that all possibilities are on the table. Daniel, I wouldn't necessarily shut the door there. Obviously, it's got to be the right fit for both sides for that to occur.
Where's Jeremiah? I'm sorry. Where does Jeremiah kind of stand in terms of his progression? And do you guys feel optimistic, pessimistic? I know it's still really early in the year, but where do you feel like?
Yeah, so he's progressing, which is a positive. I'll be honest, like, it is still a little bit nebulous in terms of what that time frame looks like. So we really are trying to deal with it, week to week and month to month. I think with Abdul, Tony, that probably the answer to that is yes. Like, you could park him at defensive end and use him in that mold, full time, and he'll be an excellent rusher. He does have the versatility where he's played a full season where it's off the ball. So I think Jim and the defensive staff, if he were Cleveland Brown, would be creative enough to use him with like the highest impact. Obviously first and foremost that's as a rusher, but look, we also do have Lamar Jackson in our division, and there are certain situations where dual speed could probably help. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put a limit on terms of how you could use them.
It's been what happens since you had a first round pick, never won this high. How does that change
change just the process in general? And I mean, you've been doing this for 5 years now. So do you look at it and say, man, we really missed that in 2020. We screwed that up. Like, are there things that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, so I'd say this, Jason. Like in terms of the process, I wouldn't say that it's too different, other than the fact that you have a little bit more certainty in terms of the pool of players who are going to be available to you, particularly at the top of the draft. So it allows you to be a little bit more focused in terms of your time and energy before the draft with the players you're going to spend the most time with. You try and learn from every draft class. Whether it's like the specific like player profile that you took a bet on, whether it's how you assess the medical risks, player makeup, you name it. You really try and draw lessons from it. You really try and draw lessons from every year. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily specific to just picking in the first round, but just how you think about the draft in general.
Is there a world in which Sean Watson becomes available to you guys at any point this season?
Yeah, I think that's too early to tell, Mary Kay. Obviously we know he's going to miss a significant portion of this season, but I wouldn't necessarily put, at least at this point, when it's still fairly early in the recovery process. I just think it's too early to put a timetable on it, or at least a definitive timetable on it.
Put out sort of a video that shows he's working hard.
Mhm.
Just really determined and he's in the building and I think about these
Yeah, no, he works his tail off for rehab. Unfortunately, he's had more experience in long-term rehab than probably anyone would care to have. But he knows how to work and be diligent in those situations. But ultimately, his body is going to tell that part of the story and how it responds and how it recovers. And it's just really too early to say.
When it comes to the cost, when it comes to the cost control, like of the first round pick, and having to fix your auction, how much value do you place on that when considering taking the quarterback in the first round?
I'd say it has value because it gives you 5 years of cost control under market. That in and of itself wouldn't drive the decision for the prospect. Like that wouldn't. It may be a little bit different if you were thinking about let's say taking a non-premium position like that high. So the whole question about Saquon Barkley a couple of years ago, where he's a great player, you take him at number 2 in the draft, but you kind of maybe eat into the economic benefit of the pick. But that's usually more the exception than the rule that you're thinking for those considerations. And quite frankly, I don't see that as being a primary driver in any decision for us this year.
Speaking of cost control, you have 2 cornerbacks that are going to be coming up or they're entering contract years in Martin and Craig.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a pathway that financially you are able to keep both, or is it potentially a one or the other type situation? I know that's
No, it's a good question, Chris. There absolutely is. I think the question will become, how we think about it from a resource allocation, question and who we add to the roster, both in this year's class and, when you get to that point in next year's class. So it's certainly a possibility. I don't think there's any type of, there's no type of limit in that regard. But it just may be relative to some of the different trade-offs that you either could or would have to make, depending on how expensive those deals became.
Is David someone that
Yeah, I think David's another one of those, players and people in the organization. We've known him since he's been 20 years old, and we've been through a lot with David, and we've been happy to see him grow and mature in the organization. Look, we love all of our long tenured Browns to be with the organization until they're done. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. So I can't necessarily make a commitment there either way. But I know David's desire is to be with the Browns long term, and that's ours as well. How and when and what that looks like. That's maybe not primary focus right now. But David we would consider one of our core players.
When you look at the free agency class of people that you guys added so far,
Yeah, so I'd say we're excited about the guys that we added. They all were signed or traded for specific roles on the roster. I think one of the things that's maybe a little bit different in terms of how we thought about the offseason, especially relative to having both high quality and high quantity of picks this year, is there are certain roster spots where we want to make sure that we create opportunity and competition, for youth on the roster, whether it's for players internally to expand their roles, or players that we will bring onto the roster in the next months or so to play. But that being said, some of the veterans, whether it's Malik Collins and Joe Trine to help continue to boost our pass rush, and especially on the interior, whether it's bringing back Devin Bush, who played really well for us at both Mike and Will, whether it's being opportunistic with Tevin Jenkins or signing Cornelius Lucas to be our swing tackle. Like those are real and they're important pieces. But that being said, we're really looking forward to the next month and adding the young guys onto the team.
Sorry, it's a little bit of an offbeat question, so excuse me in advance. I'm just obviously flag football. Olympics in a couple of years is gonna come together. I know a lot of players have talked about it being interested in that. I'm just curious from the GM perspective. Like, do you think that that's something that could feasibly work? It's gonna take place July when training camp are going on, and you kind of worry about injuries popping up and stuff like that?
That's a great question. It's something that we talked a lot about on the General Managers Advisory Committee, and then I'm on the CEC Working Group Committee, which is kind of taking the lead from maybe the collective bargaining side of that equation. And number one, I think it's great. I think it's a great international development. I think it's great for the sport. I'm actually really happy to see his development. There are some challenges to work through in that regard if we do have sizable, player petitioners during camp. I guess one of the things I look at is all right, we all probably should. It's not like we'll be the first sport to have to figure this out. We've had, it's like, the NBA's had to deal with it, hockey's had to deal with it. I think those are hurdles that we can solve. That being said, I'll be interested to see the profile of player that decides that they want to play. I'm perhaps maybe a little bit skeptical that maybe we'll see the Patrick Mahomes of the world skip, as much as I'd be very in favor of that if he's listening. Skip training camp and do the Olympics. But I think it remains to be seen what that looks like. But I want that to be successful for our sport.
Mike Hall have surgery?
I'm sorry.
Did Mike Hall have surgery on the knee
At the end of the season?
at the end of the season?
He did, and he's coming along. He's coming along really well. I'm not. Yeah, I'm not. It's a yeah. No. Yeah. He's moving appropriately. Yeah.